I have a couple of images open inside of Adobe Camera Raw, and I want to use these images to show you a basic editing workflow to optimize images. Now I'm going to optimize this image, and then I'm going to roll those settings over onto the second image, which was captured only a few minutes apart in the same location. So I've got maximum screen real estate. I'm just going to push that over to the left hand side so we fill the preview window with the first image I'm going to edit. Now this image was purposely overexposed by just over a stop, and that was to improve shadow detail here. If you ever do want to increase exposure, it's important not to clip or lose information in the highlights, but as we can see here, we could actually recover some of the highlight information. I'll just show that just by dragging the exposure slider down to show you we have full rich detail inside of this Adobe Camera Raw file. This is typically how a lot of people would expose on camera, but if you can raise the exposure in camera, then you will get better quality in the shadows, and then we just lower the exposure in post-processing. Okay, one of the first settings I'm going to actually do is to the workflow options. Here I'm setting my working space as Adobe RGB, which is a good space if we're going to print and also to web distribution of this image. The depth is set at 8 bits per channel, but given that we're doing all of the editing inside of Adobe Camera Raw, this doesn't really matter. It's only really important to move over to the higher bit depth if we're going to start making big color or tonal changes inside of the main editing space. And the other option I have selected here is Open in Photoshop as Smart Objects. This ensures that when I open my image, it will be embedded as a smart object, and this always gives me the option of editing the contents of that smart object in Adobe Camera Raw once again. So this is a completely non-destructive workflow that we're looking at here. I'll select OK. I'm quite keen to start optimizing the appearance of the image, but we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping first by coming to the Lens Corrections panel, and I'm going to come over to the profile and enable the lens profile corrections. Okay, and this has picked up the lens that was being used with this particular camera at the time and has removed some barrel distortion from that image. Because it's a wide angle lens at 24mm, there will be some chromatic aberration, which is a slight misalignment of the red, green and blues at high contrast edges in the corners of the image, and we can remove that visual problem just by clicking on the Remove Chromatic Aberration checkbox. Okay, if you ever want to use these as the defaults rather than having to check these each time, then we can just come over to this flyout menu here and choose Save New Camera Raw Defaults. This is only really a useful adjustment is if we've made no other adjustments inside of the image to tone or color, because those adjustments will also be applied as the defaults for every other image. So really we're just looking at assigning the profile and maybe the Remove Chromatic Aberration, especially when working with wide angle lenses. Okay, now we're going to return to the basic panel, and I'm going to lower the exposure. Now a lot of these adjustments are going to be reasonably subjective, so I'm just going to lower it perhaps just below a one stop lower in exposure. But again, you can lower this a little bit more, or if you prefer it brighter, a little bit less. These are subjective adjustments after all. Okay, next step I'm going to do is to select the white balance tool in the tools bar here, and we're going to select a correct white balance. Often photographers introduce a white balance reference into an image so they can click on using this tool to make sure the white balance is absolutely accurate. You'll see we're working with a current temperature of 5000 degrees Kelvin, but if I click on this white tablecloth here, you can see it's a good deal cooler, 600 degrees cooler now. Now the colors inside of the image perhaps just look a little bit flatter, so one of the next adjustments I'm going to make is to the vibrance. I'm going to raise the vibrance slider to around +30 or so to push those colors and make them a little bit richer again. Sometimes, occasionally, you might need to add in a little bit of saturation as well, because the vibrance slider is programmed to ignore colors that look similar to skin hues. Okay, and so sometimes those cannot be made as rich as we would like, and so just by raising the saturation slider we can bring those and make those as rich as the other colors in that adjustment feature. I also need to add a little bit of contrast. I think we could make a little bit more drama in this image by just adding a small amount of contrast to this image. Okay, another way of adding contrast into this image in a localized way is to add clarity. And again, this is a very subjective adjustment, and I'm going to go a little bit careful with that clarity slider because we're already creating quite a lot of drama inside of this image. Okay, and the next adjustments I'm going to make is to the whites and blacks of this image. Usually these are the last adjustments that I make when editing tone and color inside of an image. Now you can use the clipping warnings above, and you can see we've just got a little bit of clipping, and because that's not white, that just indicates that we're clipping a color in one of the channels. Okay, now the way I prefer to edit and set white and black points is to hold down the Alt key on a PC or the Option key on a Mac and then physically click on the white slider. We can see we're actually clipping a small amount of the whites and those brightest highlights on that flag in the central area. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag that white slider down, and that's not proving too effective. I'm going to have to come a long way in order to pull that down. And so we're actually looking to perhaps do a localized adjustment to modify that. I'm just going to leave that down at -20 or so, and we'll pay attention to those clip tones just a little bit later. The black slider, you'll notice there's a small gap at the back end of this histogram, and we're going to just click on there and pull that down. Now I'm not too concerned with the colors that are appearing at the moment. Again, that's just an indication that we're clipping some of the saturated colors, but we'll still have detail left in those tones. It only really when we get solid blacks appearing as they are now that we're actually going to lose information. No texture will be left in those surfaces. So I'm going to bring that back out, so just the color clipping remains, and we could probably come down to -10 or so for that to occur. So now we're using the full dynamic range of the image, and we can now move forward and do some localized adjustments. Okay, the first localized adjustments I'm going to do, I'm going to move over to the HSL tab, HSL grayscale tab here. This gives us access to hue, saturation and luminance. It's localized in the way that it will affect only a group of colors, either by their hue, their saturation or the luminance, and leave the rest of the image alone. We can also access these controls from this tool here. For instance, I can access hue, saturation or luminance independently. If I select the luminance here, you'll see that we switch over to the luminance tab, and if I want that sky to be darker, then I can just click and drag down, and I'm going to drag down to about -30, and you can also see it's picking up a little bit of the aqua there as well. I think the sky is probably looking a little bit saturated now, so I could come over to my saturation tab and click down and just lower the saturation of that sky slightly. I also think that the sky is perhaps just slightly cyan for my preference. I'd probably just like it to be more of a richer royal blue, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the hue tab and then click and drag. This time I'm going to drag it higher just a little bit, just to make that a richer blue color for myself. Okay, the next adjustment I'm going to make is with a graduated filter. You can press G on the keyboard to access this tool, and I'm going to click on the negative exposure icon here, and that will set in a -1/2 a stop. I can adjust this manually just by clicking on the slider and moving that a little bit further, and then I'm going to click probably from the top of the flag, holding down the shift key to constrain this to a perfect gradient. I'm now going to move that down right down onto the horizon line there. Okay, and then I'm going to add a second gradient at the base of the image, clicking right at the bottom of the image and dragging up a short distance into the image there. Now if I want that to be a little bit stronger, again I can come over to the exposure slider and just pull that down to a full one-stop adjustment in the lower portion of the image. And if I want to come out of this gradient tool, I can just press G on the keyboard, or I can just press the zoom tool or the hand tool to come out of that tool there. Okay, now I'm going to work with some adjustment brushes because we've added contrast. These dark cliffs here or rock formations are probably a little bit dark for me, so I'm going to click on the adjustment brush tool and make a localized exposure adjustment in that area. Now I'm just going to roll down to the base of this mask, and I'm going to show you that I have the auto mask switched off. I prefer to work using this as a default, i.e. switched off, and then only use it if I have to later. We can get edge artifacts appearing when we're working with exposure adjustments using this tool, and so I prefer to work with that one off in this instance. Now I'm going brighter in this instance, so I'm going to click on the plus icon this time. I'm going to maybe try a +1 stop. You'll see from my brush here I've got set the feather, flow and density all to 100 here. The size is a little bit large for me, so I'm just going to reduce that. We could alternatively use the square bracket keys next to the letter P on the keyboard in order to reduce that. Okay, and now I'm going to work and just paint over these cliffs. It looks like the adjustment's probably a little bit excessive. And what you'll probably also notice is as I lighten the rocks, I'm also spilling a little bit of exposure into the sky there. If I move my mouse cursor over the pin, you'll actually see where I've been working with that exposure adjustment. Okay, now the mask color is controlled over here. Okay, so if we're working over an area where the mask color is inappropriate, we can just change that mask color just by clicking on that swatch and maybe changing it to a green overlay instead. Okay, what I'd like to do now is to clean up that sky from that exposure adjustment, and so this is actually where I'm going to work by clicking on the auto mask option here. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down the Alt or Option key. Okay, we got the feather set to 0 there, so with the Option key or Alt key still selected, I'm going to bring that back up, maybe around about 50 or 60 or so. Okay, and we're going to move into the sky area now, and it's important now, if I want to clean up the sky, I keep the center of that crosshair inside of that brush behind this edge. Okay, so I'm just going to click and then roll this brush down the edge, running along in order to remove the exposure adjustment from that sky, moving all of the way around in order to remove that. Now if I put my mouse cursor over the pin, you'll see that we've effectively just limited our adjustment just to the rock formation, and we don't have any spill effect into that sky. Okay, so I think the adjustment is probably a little bit aggressive, so I'm just going to lower that back down, maybe just to a half a stop adjustment. I still want some visual weight into those areas there. Okay, the next adjustment I'm going to make is to the vignette. Now I'm just going to come out of this tool again, press the hand tool or the zoom tool to come out of there, and we're going to go to the lens corrections tab first. We do have this vignetting control here. Now typically a lot of lenses will vignette in the corners, and part of the profile correction is to remove that darkening from the corners. But if we prefer that darkening, we can actually just wind that adjustment out of that image. If I want more vignetting, then I can actually come over into the effects panel, and with the highlight priority setting I can just wind that down maybe to 10, 15 or so in order to add some small darkening into the corners. Okay. At this stage I would like to come back to the basic panel, and now that I've added some darkening in the corners, I would like to brighten that center up slightly. So I'm just going to pull that back down to a -1 stop exposure adjustment into this image now. Now there are going to be some dust spots in this image because I was working in a desert area for quite a while, and this caused a few problems with dust getting inside and sticking to the sensor. Now they might be quite difficult to detect because they're really quite subtle, but if you print them out quite large, you then might notice them. So it's always worth going into the dust or spot removal tool here, B on the keyboard, and if you're having trouble finding where the spots are, then we'll use this control called Visualize Spots. Okay, now if you can see the spots now as those are little dots appearing in the sky, we can help find those spots by using this slider. Obviously if this slider is set too low, then we can't see any problems in that sky at all. So we often need to just move that slider and come in. If we push it too far, we'll see the clouds as well, so we'll just back off a little bit just so we can see the spots. And then it's a simple case of coming in with the tool, and the brush size that you're working with here just needs to be slightly larger than the dust spots we're working with, and I'll just quickly remove all of those spots from this image. Now occasionally if you find that the spot removal is working inappropriately, then we can just modify the source point for that. Okay, I'm reasonably happy that we've got that adjusted now, so I'll click off the visualize spots, okay, and we'll come out of that adjustment. Okay, so we were working with the heel there, which is often the better of the two. Occasionally we have to switch to clone when working up against edges. Okay, but otherwise if we're working just into large broad areas of tone, the heel option is usually the best. Okay, now we're going to make some just to fine-tune adjustments to this image. Okay, we'll come back out into the main working area, and if we just want to monitor where those shadows and highlights are going to see whether they'll be appropriate for printing, we can just click on this color sampler tool and monitor some of the darkest and lightest features of this image. Again, I'm just going to hold down the Option or Alt key and then just drag that down so we can find some of the darkest tones where I want to see detail. Now I'm not too interested in the information underneath this table here, but I am interested in dropping a color sample on the front of this table here because I do want rich detail there. So I'll just drop one color sampler in that position, and then I'll just do Command Z or Control Z in order to return that black slider to the original point. Okay, we'll do the same thing with the white slider. Okay, so again holding down the Alt or Option key, clicking on the white slider, and then trying to find the brightest portion of that image, and you can see that we've got it probably on the white stripes of that flag there. So I'll just zoom in so I can make sure that I drop into a reasonably accurate area there, and drop another color sampler, and then again Command or Control Z in order to return that back to normal. Now originally we had some clipping occurring inside of those flags, but when we put that graduated filter down, taking down one stop there, that seemed to resolve the excessive brightness in that area. If that was still clipping and we didn't want to put an excessive negative value in on either the highlights or white slider, we could just use an adjustment brush. Alternatively, if this is perhaps just a little bit too high for your printer, again we could just come in with the highlight slider and bring that down, and as you can see that figure rolls down slightly as we bring in more detail using that negative highlight value. And typically if I can get that down to 250, this would be good for commercial print as well. Again, Command 0 to fit on screen. And we'll clear those color samplers now that we know we've optimized both the shadows and highlights, ready for printing. Okay, so we're going to take a snapshot of this image. Okay, so we're going to come over to the snapshots panel, and because I don't want to have to redo all of this work again if it accidentally got zeroed, I'm just going to click on that little new snapshot icon, and I'm going to call the new snapshot my edit version, and we've been working in Adobe RGB, so I might add that in to the name there and select OK. So if any time we just we're left back at the camera raw defaults, the starting position, if I ever want to return to this edit stage, I can just click on edit Adobe RGB snapshot, and all of that work is applied in one click. Okay, let's just come back into the main editing space now and bring in that other image. Okay, and as you can see, both images were actually selected, and the adjustments have also been applied automatically to this second image. If that wasn't the case, for instance, let's just zero this image by going camera raw defaults. Okay, if this image is in its basic form, but we have the edited version here, then all we need to do is select all and then hit synchronize, and you can choose what you would like to synchronize here. Okay, sometimes you might not want to synchronize the crop or the local adjustments, but in this case I am going to want to do those local adjustments, which includes the graduated filters and the spot removal. Okay, and then we'll select OK. And as you can see, all of those settings are now rolled out over the second image. There's a slight exposure difference between these two images, and so one of the adjustments that I'm probably wanting to make is, with this image selected, is just make a specific adjustment, which is to zero that exposure. Okay, and as you can see, once you've done your basic editing on one, if you've got 100 images open inside of Adobe Camera Raw, you can quickly roll all of those changes out over all of the other images. Okay, so there's a couple of ways we can finish now. We can select all, and we can export these images directly from Photoshop just by going Save Images. We can take these out as JPEGs or TIFF files and choose to then this is especially important if we have no reason to go into the main editing space of Photoshop. Alternatively, we can just select one of the images and open this up as an object inside of the main editing space. Okay, if you hit cancel, all of the changes that we've been making inside of Adobe Camera Raw will not be preserved, but if we click the Done button, all of the work will be preserved, so the next time we open these images we'll see all of our edits. I'm just going to open this image up as an object. Okay, with this image up as open as an object, I can now carry on working inside of the main editing space if required. Okay, and if I ever do need to go back into the main Adobe Camera Raw interface to make some modifications to my edit, then it's a simple case of just double clicking on this little smart object thumbnail here, and that brings me back inside of Adobe Camera Raw. If I make an adjustment, let's just say I make an exposure adjustment, brighter for instance, and select OK, this will update the preview inside of the main editing space. I actually prefer the darker version, so I'll just do Command Z on that one. Okay, and so what we've just done is we've highlighted a non-destructive workflow inside of Adobe Camera Raw to optimize our images.